In 1905, the swamplands outside Shreveport held a particular kind of silence, not peaceful silence, the kind that swallows sound whole, the kind that exists in places where no one has screamed in a very long time because there is no one left to hear it. Cypress trees stood knee-deep in black water, their roots like gnarled fingers pressed into the muck, clutching whatever the earth had chosen to keep. Travelers who ventured the inland roads spoke of a heaviness in the air past a certain mile marker, a thickness that sat in the lungs and refused to leave even after returning to town. Most dismissed it as swamp gas, the natural rot of a wet and ancient land. They were wrong. The Renault family disappeared in February of that year. A husband, his pregnant wife, and 2 daughters under the age of 7. Their wagon was found 3 days later by a trapper who almost walked past it, assuming it had simply been abandoned. The horses were gone. Every belonging remained untouched inside, a quilt folded neatly on the bench seat, a tin of biscuits still warm from the morning. There was no blood, no sign of struggle. No tracks leading anywhere that the trapper's dogs could follow for more than 100 meters before they began to whimper and circle back. The trapper noted later that the dogs refused to face the direction of the interior swamp, that they kept their tails pressed flat and their eyes wide and white-rimmed, the way animals behave when something has stripped the instinct of courage straight out of them. It wasn't the first disappearance. It wasn't close to the last. The Boudreaux family had settled their isolated property more than 6 decades prior, a land grant from a grandfather who had wanted nothing more than to never see another person again for the rest of his life. He had gotten his wish, and then some. By 1905, the property sat nearly 2 hours by horseback from the nearest town, accessible only by trails that became submerged during rains and treacherous even in dry months. 14 people lived on those grounds. The outside world had no idea. The outside world, in fact, would have preferred to go on not knowing. Celestin Boudreaux was 73. Years old and small enough that a man might mistake her for a child from a distance. Up close, that mistake dissolved immediately. Her eyes were pale and fixed in the manner of something that has long since stopped being surprised by anything, because it has seen everything, done everything, decided that consequence was a concept invented by weaker people. She wore the same dark dress every day. She smelled of wood smoke and rendered fat and something underneath both of those things that no visitor had ever been able to name before turning away. She had run the family with the efficiency of a mill owner and the absolute authority of someone who had never once in her adult life been told no by anyone who continued breathing afterward. Her son Alcide was 41, tall and angular, with hands so deeply scarred they looked like something carved rather than grown. He rarely spoke. When he did, the sound was low and wet, as though his voice came from somewhere deeper in his chest than voices were meant to originate. His half-sister Marguerite was 37, and she had inherited her mother's eyes without softening them at all. She managed the women and the children, organizing their work with the quiet precision of someone who understood that efficiency was a form of love, and that love in the Boudreaux family meant usefulness. If you were useful, you were valued. If you were valued, you continued. The cousins Rocard and Delphine filled out the adult core. Rocard was enormous and nearly wordless. Delphine existed in a state of devotion to Celestin, so complete it bordered on religious ecstasy. When the old woman spoke, Delphine's lips moved slightly, repeating the words a half-second behind, as though learning scripture. The children were the part that disturbed the few outsiders who ever glimpsed them. 7 of them, ranging from 6 years old to 16, always moving in a cluster, always slightly too quiet, always watching. They spoke to each other in an archaic dialect that even the most elderly French descendants in the parish couldn't fully parse. It had drifted across generations into something adjacent to French, but not quite, a private language shaped by isolation and, perhaps, by the specific needs of describing things that had no innocent words. The property itself was a labyrinth of dark wood and improvised construction, spreading across several acres of waterlogged earth. From a distance, it looked like any struggling rural settlement. Up close, something felt wrong in the same instinctive way that an animal feels wrong before it identifies what the wrong thing is. The silence was organized. 14 people living together should produce sound. Children should argue and laugh and slam doors. Instead, everything moved with the coordinated quiet of a single large organism that had learned long ago not to draw attention to itself. The prosperity began around 1901. Before that, the Boudreau family had been gaunt and threadbare in the way of people living at the edge of what the land could provide. After, they were still thin, but differently thin. The leanness of people who eat regularly and work hard rather than the hollowness of slow starvation. Their clothes improved. The children's eyes changed, gaining a brightness that had not been there before, a satisfaction that sat behind the irises like a low, warm fire. The local merchant noticed first. The family had begun bringing large quantities of salted meat into town for trade, more than any family without cattle or a substantial herd could reasonably produce. He asked once about the source and received the answer he would receive every time afterward: swamp game. He accepted it. He sold it. He noticed, without examining the noticing too closely, that the meat had a peculiar quality. Lighter than venison, more tender than boar. A faint sweetness in the smell that lingered even through the salt and the wrapping cloth, a smell that made him want to set it down and step away from it, though he never quite understood why. The Boudreau children, during their supervised town visits, approached the butcher counter with a specific kind of attention. They would lean in and smell the cuts displayed there, not with the hunger of children who wanted something, but with the evaluative interest of someone comparing a professional standard against their own work. They always seemed slightly disappointed. Once, the merchant caught the oldest girl murmuring something in that dialect to a younger boy while they looked at the hanging carcasses. The boy nodded seriously, like a student confirming a lesson already learned. Father Edouard Villers had attempted pastoral visits to the property on 3 occasions. Each time, Alcide met him at the property's edge, standing in the path with his scarred hands loose at his sides, polite enough in word but immovable in presence. Behind him, in the shadows between the sheds, figures moved. The priest counted them on his last visit. At least 12 different people watching from a distance, appearing and disappearing between structures with the fluid silence of people who had rehearsed exactly this contingency. He left each time with the sensation of having come very close to something without understanding what it was. In his private notes he wrote, "There is something organized about their concealment. They do not hide the way frightened people hide. They hide the way people hide who have something that must not be seen." Families had been disappearing from the inland road since early 1902, always travelers, always alone, always wagons found abandoned in the same broad region with belongings untouched and horses released, and no, Evidence of violence and no bodies and no explanation. The Morrison family, 5 people including 3 children, vanished in March of that year. The Thibodeau family, 3 people, 2 weeks after. By the end of 1902, 8 families had simply ceased to exist. By 1904, the roads had grown quiet out of fear, and the quiet made the land lonelier, and the loneliness made it easier for what was happening to continue happening. Father Villers was walking a trail half a mile from the Boudreau property in August of 1905 when the summer rains had done their work on the soft soil. He smelled it before he saw it. Not decomposition exactly, sweeter than decomposition, more intimate. He followed the smell to a washed-out section of ground and found what the earth had been hiding, scraps of fabric that had clearly been cut from clothing rather than worn away naturally. Children's shoes, some still holding the shape of the feet that had been inside them. A rag doll with old dark staining on the cloth face, buttons, a pocket watch stopped at 11:20. He dug carefully with his hands and found bones mixed with animal remains in an obvious attempt to make the quantity unremarkable, and he understood then with the particular coldness of certain knowledge that he had been walking past a graveyard without a surface. He brought everything he had gathered to Sheriff Auguste Marchand in a leather bag and laid it out on the table between them without speaking first. The sheriff looked at the children's shoes for a long time. Then he looked at the rag doll. Then he asked the priest what he believed, and the priest told him what he believed, and the sheriff was quiet for another long moment before he began writing. The search party arrived at the Boudreau property with 15 armed men and 4 dogs, and the dogs began pulling frantically in the direction of the first shed before the men had finished dismounting. What they found inside that shed reordered the categories of what the investigators understood human beings to be capable of. Wooden tables, 4 of them, deeply stained with layers of old and older blood. Knives adapted from farm tools, arranged by size along one wall. Bone saws, hooks in the ceiling beams, dozens of them. An area near the back where the floor had been salted and where the smell was so dense and so specific that 2 of the deputies stepped outside and did not return. The shed was not organized like a place where something terrible had happened once. It was organized like a place where something had been refined into a process, where the work had been done enough times that efficiency had become automatic, where the horror had become routine. A second structure contained 50 or more barrels of salt, drying racks, a smoking apparatus sophisticated enough that the coroner would later describe it as indicating serious commitment to quality preservation. A third shed held shelves of labeled product, the labels handwritten in that half-French dialect, organized by criteria the investigators could not immediately understand and then gradually, horribly could. A fourth structure was filled with the belongings of the dead, arranged almost tenderly on shelves and hooks, clothes, jewelry, a child's spinning top, a woman's hairbrush with hair still wound through the bristles. In the main house, beneath the floorboard, they found Celestin's notebooks. 40 years of careful record-keeping in a cramped, precise hand. Each entry described a family, number of members. Physical descriptions, estimated yield, preparation notes, assessments of quality, comparisons against prior harvests. The notebooks read like the production records of a prosperous and careful enterprise. When Celestin was taken into custody, she sat in the examination room and looked at the men across the table with the expression of someone waiting for them to ask the right question. She confirmed everything without hesitation. She had no interest in denial, because she had no concept of wrongdoing. In her recorded statements, she compared her work to farming with a consistency that suggested the comparison was genuine rather than rhetorical. She had fed a large family in an isolated place with limited resources. She had done so intelligently and efficiently. She had turned a necessity into a sustainable commercial operation. She had done what any competent matriarch would do. When asked about the children in the wagon of one particular family, she paused, and for a moment the investigators thought something close to human remorse might surface. Instead, according to the official transcript, she said only that the younger ones were always more work to process, but that the yield was worth the effort. And then she moved on to other details, answering a question no one had asked her. Marguerite, during her own interrogation, corrected the prosecutor on a technical point about preparation methodology with the patient tone of an expert addressing a capable but uninformed student. She was proud of the system they had built. She said so directly. The prosecutor later described the experience of questioning her as the closest he had come to losing his professional composure in 20 years of practice. The 5 children captured at the property were examined by the coroner, who documented both the physical consequences of generations of inbreeding and the psychological architecture of children who had been raised inside a fully enclosed moral world where the thing they had done since birth was not only acceptable, but was a source of pride, skill, and belonging. The youngest, a girl of 6 named Lizette, demonstrated the greatest potential for adaptation. The older children showed varying degrees of cognitive damage and a fundamental inability to locate the moral categories that would allow them to understand what the outside world was demanding of them. When the eldest boy was asked if he understood that what his family had done was wrong, he considered the question for a long time with genuine effort, and then said that he understood that people outside the swamp felt that way, but that he could not feel it himself, no matter how hard he tried. He was not being defiant. He was being honest. Celestin Boudreau was hanged in December of 1905. By witness accounts, she climbed the scaffold without assistance and stood under the noose with the same flat composure she had brought to every room she had ever entered. Her last words, recorded in the official register, expressed the conviction that desperate families in desperate places would eventually understand what she had understood, and that history would treat her more fairly than the law had. No one in the crowd responded. The rope dropped and the crowd was very quiet, and then people began walking home through the cold, and no one spoke much on the way. Marguerite died in prison 2 years later, refusing meat of any other kind until her body gave out, choosing slow extinction over compromise. 7 family members escaped into the swamp the day of the raid and were never conclusively found. In the months that followed, hunters reported seeing ragged figures moving through the deepest parts of the wetland, further in than anyone with a choice would go. In early 1906, lumberjacks found the remains of a fire on a remote island and, around it, human bones that had been processed in a manner consistent with the sheds on the Boudreau property. Whether the fugitives had found new victims or had turned on each other, the evidence could not confirm. Dr. Marcellin, who examined the bones, noted in his report that the distinction may not have been meaningful to them. The property was burned in September 1906. The fire took 5 days to exhaust itself, fed by fat that had soaked into the soil over 4 years of continuous use, and the smoke could be smelled across the parish. After it finished, the land sat empty and avoided. In the flood seasons that followed, the earth returned what it had been asked to hold: fragments of bone, buttons, a child's shoe. the backing of a small mirror, rising slowly through the soft ground to lie on the surface in the pale morning light where anyone who passed by could see them. Almost no one passed by. The swamp kept its silence. The cypress trees stood in their dark water. And the question that no investigator, no doctor, no priest ever fully answered continued to hang in the air above that scorched and empty ground. Not how human beings could do such a thing, but how easily, once the first step had been taken, the second step had followed, and then the third, and then the 100th, each one smoother than the last, until it was simply the way life worked, as natural as the seasons, as unremarkable as hunger, as ordinary as the daily business of keeping a family alive in a world that had stopped watching.